Hello and thanks for checking out this episode of Into the Killing. If you know of a case we should cover on Into the Killing, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com. On our website, you can also suggest cases for our two YouTube channels, Criminally Listed and Paranormally Listed. For this week's episode, we're going back to September 1966. September 4th, 1966 was the first day the Jerry Lewis MDA Labor Day Telethon broadcasted. Jerry Lewis rose to fame as part of the duo Martin and Lewis with the King of Cool, Dean Martin. They made 16 films together between 1949 and 1956. Martin went on to have his own solo career, and he was a member of the famed Rat Pack. Jerry Lewis continued to star in his own films, most notably The Night Professor in 1963. In the early 1950s, Lewis was asked to host a telethon for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. At the time, there was not much public awareness about muscular dystrophy. According to the Mayo Clinic, muscular dystrophy is a group of diseases that cause progressive weakness and loss of muscle mass. Lewis agreed to help, and he and Martin hosted a telethon. Lewis sporadically hosted telethons for the Muscular Dystrophy Association over the next decade. Then, on September 4th, 1966, Lewis launched the Jerry Lewis MDA Labor Day Telethon, which aired on WNEW TV. It raised just over $1 million. Accounting for inflation, that is about $9.5 million in early 2024. Lewis hosted the telethon for 44 years and retired in 2010. During those 44 years, he had famous guests appear on the telethon, including Frank Sinatra, Jerry Seinfeld, Robin Williams, and many more. One of the most memorable moments happened in 1976 when Frank Sinatra brought out Lewis's former partner, Dean Martin. Lewis and Martin had not seen each other in over a decade. The telethon continued another 4 years after Lewis retired, with different hosts. The telethon raised over $2 billion for the Muscular Dystrophy Association, but there were criticisms of the telethon. Some people thought that Lewis treated people with muscular dystrophy like pathetic victims. There were also some questions about how the money was spent. Jerry Lewis, who was nicknamed the King of Comedy, died in August 2017 at the age of 91. On September 6, 1966, South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd was stabbed to death in the House of Assembly in South Africa. Verwoerd was the architect of the apartheid, which was a set of policies that created racial segregation in South Africa that was introduced in 1948. Verwoerd became Prime Minister in 1958 after serving as Minister of Native Affairs. On April 9, 1960, Verwoerd was shot twice in the head by David Pratt, an English farmer and businessman. Verwoerd was hit in the right cheek and right ear, and he survived. He said that his survival was evidence that he was doing God's work. The would-be assassin, David Pratt, was sent to a psychiatric hospital. On October 1, 1961, the day before Pratt was to be considered for parole, he died in custody. It was labeled as suicide, but often in South Africa at the time, the police would murder people and say they died by suicide. 6 years after the failed assassination attempt, the 64-year-old Prime Minister was stabbed after entering the House of Assembly. He was stabbed 4 times in the chest and the neck by Dimitri Tasfandas. Tasfandas was a 48-year-old parliamentary messenger from Portuguese Mozambique. He was of Greek descent. Hendrik Verwoerd was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Tasfandas said that he received messages from a tapeworm in his stomach to kill the Prime Minister. Tasfandas had a history of mental illness. He was hospitalized in 5 countries for his mental health problems. Tasfandas had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity, and he was institutionalized. He was detained at the pleasure of the state president, meaning only the government could release him. The apartheid ended over 2 decades later in the early 1990s. Dimitri Tasfandas died in 1999 while still in custody at age 81. Today it's believed that Tasfandas was politically motivated and he killed Hendrik Verwoerd because he thought he was a racist tyrant. On September 11, 1966, 19-year-old pitcher Nolan made his major league debut for the New York Mets. The Mets were hosting the Atlanta Braves. Ryan came out to pitch in the 6th inning. He pitched for 2 innings and struck out 3 batters. He only allowed 1 hit. The Mets ended up losing 8-3, but this game marked the start of one of the most amazing careers in baseball history. 13 years after his debut, Ryan became the first player to sign a $1 million contract when he signed with the Houston Astros. Ryan would go on to play 27 seasons in the major leagues. He and Cap Anson share the record for most MLB seasons played. He holds 51 other records, including most strikeouts. Ryan recorded 5,714 strikeouts. The second most is Randy Johnson with 4,875, which is 839 less. It's also believed that Ryan threw the fastest pitch in history. In 1974, radars recorded how fast the ball was traveling when it got close to home plate. But the ball travels the fastest when it leaves the pitcher's hand. Based on calculations, it's believed that he threw a 108.1 mile/hour fastball. However, this is unofficial. The official fastest pitch was thrown by relief pitcher Lourdes Chapman in September 2010 while playing for the Cincinnati Reds. Nolan Ryan retired from baseball in 1993 at age 46. When he started playing in 1966, he was the youngest person in the league. When he retired, he was the oldest. In 1999, Nolan Ryan was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. On September 17, 1966, the number one song was You Can't Hurry Love by the Supremes. The number one movie was The Sound of Music. It had returned to the number one spot after 11 weeks. It was the 80th week of its release. On September 17, 1966, DiAnne Keidel was 31 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona with her 4 children. She was divorcing her second husband, Lyle Eugene Keidel, who went by the name Gene. Diane was born DiAnne Keidel in April 1935 in Peoria, Illinois. In 1956, when Diane was 21, she was living in Peoria. She was recently divorced and she had a 2-year-old daughter, Susie. To make some money, Diane worked at her father's grocery store. That's where she met the man who would become her second husband, Gene. They got married that year. They eventually relocated to Phoenix, Arizona. Gene got a job as a machinist. He later became a self-employed house contractor. The couple had 3 children of their own. Greg was born in 1957, followed by Kelly in 1958, and Lori in 1961. Diane and Gene's marriage was marred by violence. Gene was also abusive to the kids. Diane and Gene both abused alcohol. They both had extramarital affairs. Diane even had affairs with some of Gene's co-workers. Gene supposedly overheard co-workers talking about Diane. They said she was pregnant and had an abortion. This was after Gene had a vasectomy. In July 1966, Diane filed for a divorce. Gene moved into an apartment with his father about a mile from the family's home. We're just going to take a short break to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Factor. Eating better is easy with Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals. Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef-crafted, dietitian approved, and ready to go in just 2 minutes. You'll have over 35 options to choose from every week, including Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Also, there are more than 60 add-ons to help you stay fueled up and feeling good all day long. What are you waiting for? Get started today and get after your goals. When I heard about Factor for the first time, it reminded me of that line from the movie Jerry Maguire, "You had me at hello." Premium restaurant quality meals that are ready in just 2 minutes? Where have you been my entire life? Factor is perfect for someone like me who hates meal planning and has poor time management skills because there's no prep, cooking, or mess. So it's great for home and work. Just pick the meals you want, and Factor is flexible because you can pause or reschedule your delivery whenever you want. Plus, Factor has you covered for the entire day. They have breakfast meals like pancakes and smoothies and other midday bites, plus so much more. Factor's meals are dietitian approved, so not only do they taste great, but they are also nutritious. They're also a great value because they are cheaper than takeout. So why not check out Factor today? Especially because they have a great deal for our listeners. Head to factormeals.com/listed50 and use the code listed50 to get 50% off. That's code listed50 at factormeals.com/listed50 to get 50% off. Please visit Factor today because you'll get delicious heat and eat meals and you'll be supporting this podcast. On September 17, 1966, Jean and Lori took the kids to a fast food restaurant for dinner. Then Jean and Diane went to a bar and drank. They left the bar around 11:15 p.m. Diane drove Jean home. Diane then went to a bar to meet the man she had been seeing, Bob Marlin. Marlin was a former co-worker of Jean's. Around 1 a.m., Diane left the bar and drove home. The next day, Jean reported Diane missing. The police went to the family's home and found Diane's car parked in the carport. Her purse, identification, and keys were in the house. Jean explained that the night before he had called the house and talked to Susie. He found out that Diane wasn't home. He went to the house and relieved the babysitter. He said that he fell asleep around 3 a.m. He woke a couple of hours later at 5:30 a.m. and discovered Diane missing. The police talked to the last person who saw Diane, Bob Marlin. Marlin said that Diane left the bar at 1 a.m. He called her twice at home about an hour later, and no one answered. Marlin also had some interesting information about Jean. He said that Jean had been stalking Diane. A week earlier, Jean had taken photographs of him and Diane outside the family's home. Marlin said that he ran Jean off. The police never did a follow-up interview with Bob Marlin. He died of a heart attack the next day. At the time of her disappearance, Diane was working in an office. 2 days after she was reported missing, when Diane didn't show up for work, one of her co-workers called the police to report her missing. The investigators talked to the co-worker. She said that Diane was afraid of Jean. She also said that Jean had been stalking Diane. He'd watch her from an alley behind the house. The same day Diane went missing, Jean moved back into the family's home. Jean told everyone that Diane had run off with a boyfriend, but not many people believed him. People who knew Diane said she was a devoted mother who would never abandon her children. Also, if she was going to run away, why didn't she take her purse, clothes, or any other personal belongings? The detectives on the case believed that Jean was responsible for her disappearance. He had a history of abusing Diane, he was stalking her, and he did not have a strong alibi. He said that he did not see Diane on the morning she went missing, but the police knew that Diane had come home while he was there. The problem was that the police could not find any evidence that Jean made Diane disappear. The police talked to 12-year-old Susie, Diane's daughter from her first marriage. She said she went to sleep after her stepfather came over. She said she didn't see or hear anything unusual. They also interviewed Greg, who claimed that the family had no problems. So it wasn't long before the case went cold. Four months later, tragedy struck the family. Just before midnight on January 9, 1967, a fire broke out in the family's house. Neighbors saw the fire and one called the fire department. Several neighbors rushed to help. 9-year-old Greg was able to climb out of his bedroom window. Neighbors could hear the 3 girls screaming inside the house, but the fire was too intense to help them. The fire department arrived, and while wearing a breathing apparatus, firefighter Ray Mullins entered the house. He found 8-year-old Kelly in bed and handed her to another firefighter through a window. Mullins then found 12-year-old Susie, who was lying on top of 5-year-old Lori. He got them out of the house, laying them on the ground. Tragically, 12-year-old Susie and 8-year-old Kelly had both died. Lori had 3rd, 4th, and 5th degree burns on 50% of her body. 5th degree burns are the most serious type of burns, and bones can be charred. 5-year-old Lori was taken to the hospital, where she was in critical condition. Susie is credited with protecting Lori from the fire and ultimately saving her. Lori later said that as her sister laid on top of her, she kept saying, I love you, and I'll never leave you." Lori said that was the purest love she had ever experienced. Gene was not at home when the fire started. He claimed he had been at a nearby laundromat drying some clothes. One thing that many people found odd was how he acted at the scene. He was standing among the crowd of onlookers. Neighbors had to point him out to the police on the scene. When Gene finally came forward, he seemed emotionless when he saw his stepdaughter and 2 daughters lying on the lawn with severe burns on their bodies. He also smelled of alcohol. He told a police officer he picked up a beer and drank it at the laundromat, but the officer said it smelled like he had a lot more than 1 beer. Days after the fire, it was declared that the fire was an accident. According to Gene, he put an aluminum pot on a burner for coffee the next morning, but he didn't realize that the burner was on. The investigators concluded that all the water boiled away and then the pot melted. This led to the pot exploding, which led to the curtains catching fire. In the 36 hours after the fire, Lori clung to life in the hospital. Her heart stopped twice. Many people at the hospital noted that Gene was rarely there. The first night, within hours of the fire, he had gone home with a woman he was dating. Gene got the insurance money and he rebuilt the house. After 85 days, Lori was taken out of the hospital and she went to live with Gene and her brother Greg. The fire confirmed for a lot of people that Diane was dead. They thought if she had just run away, the death of 2 of her children and Lori being in critical condition would have drawn her out. But no one heard from her. In 1969, the police reopened Diane's disappearance, but they did not come any closer to figuring out what happened to 31-year-old DiAnne Keidel. The case then went cold. 27 years went by. Then in June 1993, there was a major break in the case. In 1966, popular movies that were released were the spaghetti western The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and Fantastic Voyage. In 1993, some popular movies that were released were Groundhog Day, Mrs. Doubtfire, and The Fugitive. 1993 was a huge year for director Steven Spielberg. Jurassic Park was released in June, and months later, in November, Schindler's List was released. Jurassic Park became the highest-grossing film of all time. It also launched the media franchise, which has made over $5 billion in revenue. It was nominated for 3 Academy Awards: Best Sound Editing, and Best Visual Editing. Schindler's List, a Holocaust film, was also a box office hit. It made $32 million on a $22 million budget. It was nominated for 12 Academy Awards. It won 7 awards, including Best Picture, and Spielberg took home his first, and at this time, only Best Director award. Schindler's List is considered one of the best films ever made. In 1966, 3 major shows that debuted on television were Star Trek, Mission Impossible, and Batman. 27 years later, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the 4th Star Trek series, debuted. In the 27 years since Diane went missing, 2 Batman movies have been released, one in 1989 and the sequel, Batman Returns, in 1992. Tim Burton directed both films, and tonally, they were a major departure from the campiness of the 1966 series. In 1988, Mission Impossible was brought back as a television series that lasted 2 seasons. The film series, starring Tom Cruise, debuted in 1996. Besides Star Trek Deep Space Nine, other shows that debuted in 1993 were Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, The Late Show with David Letterman, and Beavis and Butthead. Products released in 1966 include NyQuil, Whiteout, and Scope mouthwash. In 1966, you could get Cool Whip, Quaker Instant Oatmeal, and Doritos for snacks. Doritos was the first tortilla chips sold nationally in the United States. Doritos' initial flavor was toasted corn. The famous nacho cheese flavor was introduced 6 years later, in 1972. In 1993, new products included Beanie Babies, one of the earliest personal digital assistants, the Apple Newton, and and the ill-fated 3DO video game console. As for food and drink released that year, there were Warheads Candy, Pepsi Max, and Belvedere Vodka. On June 9, 1993, Jean and Diane's youngest daughter, 31-year-old Lori, walked into the Phoenix police station. Lori had gotten married 10 years earlier, and her last name was Romanek, but she had divorced her husband after several years of marriage. Lori spoke with cold case investigator Ed Reynolds. She told him she knew what happened to her mother. Lori explained that the night her mother went missing, she had come home from the bar. Her mother and father got into an argument and it turned physical. Lori said that the fight drew her and her older sister, Susie, out of the bedroom. Her mother saw them and told them to go back to bed. While Diane was distracted, Jean hit her with an intense right hook. Their mother fell and hit her head on a door railing and then slumped to the floor. Susie and Lori then hid in a closet where they fell asleep. Lori said she woke a short time later and went looking for her mother. Lori heard her father digging in the backyard, so she stepped out the back door to investigate. Her mother's body was beside the pool. Lori thought that her mother was sleeping. She thought it was odd that her father was doing yard work in the middle of the night while her mother was sleeping in the yard near him. Lori said that Susie came and got her and brought her back inside. 3 days later, Jean borrowed a cement mixer from work and poured 6 inches of cement over the area where he had been digging. Jean told neighbors that it was the foundation for his shed, but he never constructed a shed. Lori said that Jean knew she had seen the assault and had seen him bury her mother in the backyard. But Lori was only 5 when her mother was killed, and she did not understand death. One time at a party, Jean saw her throwing pieces of bread in the corner of the backyard where her mother was buried. Lori explained to the detective that the family had a pet turtle, but it had gone missing after its cage was left open. Lori and her sister concluded it climbed into a hole under the sandbox to hibernate. Susie told her to leave some bread chunks near the hole for when the tortoise woke up because it might be hungry. So when Jean asked Lori what she was doing, she told him that she was leaving food for her mother in case she was hungry when she woke up. Jean told her to stop talking about her mother waking up. Then, 4 months after Diane went missing, there was the deadly fire that killed her 2 sisters and nearly killed her. Lori's 2 sisters were buried in an unmarked grave while she was still in the hospital, so she did not attend their funerals. About a year after the fire, Lori went to the funeral of a young man who had lived in the neighborhood. He had been killed in the Vietnam War. Lori screamed that someone needed to wake up the young man, but an older lady explained to her that the young man was dead and he would never wake up. Finally, Lori realized that her mother was dead. Lori explained to Detective Reynolds that the murder wasn't a repressed memory. She said she always remembered the fight and her father burying her mother in the backyard. After she moved out of that house, there were times when she returned to the home and asked the people living there if she could stand by the pool. She did that because she wanted to be close to her mother. Lori explained she waited 27 years to come forward because she was terrified of her father. He had mentally and physically abused her most of her life. Jean wasn't the only one to abuse her. When she was 11, her brother Greg and his friends started sexually abusing her. Sadly, they weren't the only ones to sexually abuse her. When she was 15, one of Jean's friends raped her and she became pregnant. She terminated the pregnancy. Lori told Detective Reynolds that she believed that the fire was not an accident. She thinks her father started the fire to kill her because she knew the location of her mother's body. Lori said that her father told her different stories about the fire's origin. Initially, he told her that he accidentally left a pan with water for coffee on a hot burner. But later, he blamed it on Susie, who had saved her by laying on top of her and shielding her from the flames. Her father told her that Susie was cooking on the stove and left the pot on a hot burner. Lori knew that this wasn't true because Susie was asleep at the time of the fire. She also said that after the fire, her father was still trying to silence her. For example, he took her out of the hospital early against the advice of doctors and hospital orders. Her skin was still healing. Lori went back to the house, which was still being rebuilt, and smelled of the fire that killed her two sisters and nearly killed her. Lori thought that her father did this to maintain control over her. She also said that her father would take her out on his boat on the San Diego Bay. He would throw her in the water and tell her to swim back to shore. Sometimes they were so far out that she couldn't see the shore. He then drove the boat back to the shore. Lori said that her skin was still healing from the burns, and as she swam, her skin opened and she bled. She said that this drew fish to her and they bit her. But she ultimately made it back to the shore every time. Lori said that her father was always surprised to see her. Lori later realized that this would have been an easy way to kill her and make it look like an accident. Lori said that this happened 8 to 10 times and then she refused to go on the boat. Lori said that as the years passed, she pretended she didn't know what happened to her mother. Her father then stopped trying to kill her. When Lori was 18, she moved out and didn't tell her father where she went. Then one day, he suddenly showed up at her home. She was not sure how he found her. Randomly, he would make appearances in her life. Lori knew it was to keep her afraid so she wouldn't go to the police. But after 27 years, she finally had the courage to tell the police the truth. She also gave Detective Reynolds a written statement which she signed in front of him. Lori believed that by telling the detective what happened to her mother, it would immediately lead to the backyard being dug up. But it was not that easy. Detective Reynolds did not doubt that Lori believed she was telling the truth. The problem was that it was a 27-year-old memory from when she was 5. It simply wasn't a reliable enough statement. Nevertheless, Detective Reynolds began to investigate. He learned that the initial investigators who worked on Diane's disappearance had asked their superiors in 1966 to break up the concrete and search the backyard. Their request was denied. Detective Reynolds thought this was promising, so he continued to investigate. He contacted Lori's brother, Greg. Greg did not know what happened to his mother. Greg ended up telling his father that Lori had gone to the police and told them she had witnessed him murder their mother and saw him bury her body in the backyard. Jean called Lori and told her to keep quiet or she'd be sorry. Lori then started sleeping with a gun under her pillow. Over a month after the meeting with Detective Reynolds, Lori Romanek had a reunion with the surviving firefighters who were there on the night of the fire. This included the man who saved her, Ray Mullins, who had since retired. Lori and Mullins continued to communicate after the reunion. She told him that she had gone to the police regarding her mother's disappearance and the fire. Mullins said he would help if he could. Lori and Mullins eventually started dating. Detective Reynolds tracked down Jean's second wife, whom he had since divorced. He had married her in 1969, 2 years after the deadly blaze. She told Detective Reynolds that Jean was a violent alcoholic. She heard rumors around the neighborhood that Diane was buried in the backyard. At the time, she did not believe it. But, with the benefit of hindsight, she thought it could be possible. She remembered while living in the house, she wanted to plant a rose bush in the backyard to hide the pool pump. Jean snapped and threatened to kill her. She also told Detective Reynolds that Jean was abusive to Lori. He remembered one incident when Lori came home late and Jean beat her. She had to stop Jean because he was getting excited as he beat her. After a series of bad investments, Jean was forced to sell the house in 1971. Jean's second wife said shortly after they sold the house, they returned to get a rollaway bed they had let the new owners borrow. When they arrived, Jean heard a jackhammer in the backyard and freaked out. He ran through the house and into the backyard and found the new owner chipping away at part of the concrete. The new homeowner explained he was putting in a hot tub. Jean told him not to put it in that location because there were pipes and wiring. He offered to help him install the hot tub in a different area. The new owner agreed, and Jean followed through with his offer to help. The area where the rose bush was going to be planted and the hot tub installed was where Lori said her mother was buried. Detective Reynolds also tracked down Kitty Andrews, the woman Jean was dating at the time of Diane's disappearance and the fire. Kitty said that she was at a low point in her life when she met Jean. She had been a devout Christian, but shortly before she started dating Jean, she experienced great hardship. She got divorced, was raped, and one of her children, a toddler, died from liver disease. This led to her drinking too much and hanging out at bars. She said that after Diane disappeared, Jean let her wear her clothes. Kitty was interviewed about the fire in 1967. At the time, she said she ate dinner with Jean and his kids, and then they went shopping at a local mall. They returned to the Keidel home around 9 p.m. and stayed for about 30 minutes. Jean then drove her to her home. He went inside for about half an hour and then returned home. Jean was there while she was being interviewed, and he said that after he dropped her off, he went directly home. Around 11:40, he went to the laundromat. When Kitty was interviewed nearly 3 decades later, she said that wasn't what happened. She said they didn't go shopping, and Jean didn't drive her home. She said that day, she and her young son went to the Keidel home and washed the family's clothes. But there was a problem. The dryer didn't work. Jean was furious that she left the clothes wet. She had never seen him so angry, so she got her son and drove herself home. Then, hours after the fire, while Lori was in critical condition in the hospital, Jean came to her home. Within 4 hours of the blaze that killed his daughter and stepdaughter, and his other daughter was in critical condition, they had sex. Kitty also said that Jean blamed the fire on Susie. He said she caused it by making popcorn on the stove. But Kitty didn't think the story made much sense. Detective Reynolds talked to other people about the fire, and Jean gave them different explanations for the cause. He told his only son Greg that a frying pan with grease and potatoes had been left on the burner, which was still on. It splattered grease around the stove, which led to the fire. Jean told a neighbor that Susie had put a pot of water on the stove. Jean thought she was going to boil some eggs, but she went to bed and forgot about the pot. Hours after the fire, Jean told the detective he must have accidentally turned the stove on while wiping it down. In September 1993, Detective Reynolds asked the fire department to reopen the case, and they agreed. According to the news journal, the Phoenix New-Times, the police and the fire department didn't do several things that arson investigators are supposed to do. They did not interview the firefighters at the scene or the surviving children. They didn't even review the reports or study photographs of the scene. Nor was there an official examination of the burns on the bodies of Lori, Susie, and Kelly. They took samples of ash, but they should have taken floor samples from the area around the fire's origin and other parts of the house. Finally, while Jean was interviewed, he was never formally interrogated. Ray Mullins, who rescued Lori and dated her as an adult, was convinced there was a cover-up. He always thought that the blaze was intentionally set. He was in the house while it was engulfed in flames, and he said it was too hot to be a kitchen fire. He believed that an accelerant had been used. Detective Reynolds talked to the original arson investigator. He said that the case had always bothered him. He had seen photos of the burns on the bodies. If it had been an accidental kitchen fire, the fire would spread through the ceiling and the children would have burns on their heads and upper bodies. But most of the burns were on lower parts of their bodies, meaning the fire was on the floor. Also, the fire spread very quickly. It was too fast for it to be an accidental kitchen fire. Finally, the fire's origins, known as a hotspot, was found about 10 feet from the stove. There were 2 other hotspots found in the house. This was all evidence that an accelerant had been poured on the floor throughout the house. Although the investigator was suspicious, he was ordered to wrap up the investigation quickly, so he labeled it an accident. After the fire department reopened the investigation in 1993, they discovered many files had been destroyed because the fire had been labeled an accident. However, the few available documents further proved it was arson. Notably, the toxicology reports showed high carbon monoxide levels in the children's bodies, indicating that an accelerant had been used. By 1994, Detective Ed Reynolds was convinced that DiAnne Keidel had started the deadly fire. But he had a problem. The arson investigation did not get him any closer to getting a warrant to dig up the backyard. So he continued to look for ways to look under cement without disturbing it. He called an FBI agent he knew, and the agent put him in contact with the Colorado-based nonprofit group NecroSearch International. They help and train police agencies worldwide in locating, identifying, and excavating human remains. A geophysicist from the group, Clark Davenport, met with Detective Reynolds in September 1994. Davenport told him they would be able to use ground-penetrating radar. The radar would indicate if soil had been removed and put back in. Detective Reynolds then asked the owner of the home where the Keidels lived when Diane went missing if they could search using the radar, and they agreed. Davenport found an anomaly that was 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep in the spot where Lori said her mother was buried. Reynolds then went to get a search warrant. By this point, Lori was getting impatient. She decided she was going to buy the property and have her mother's remains unearthed. She called Detective Reynolds and told her what she planned to do. Reynolds asked her for 24 hours before she did anything, and Lori agreed. Detective Reynolds then got the warrant. Reynolds and his team broke up the cement and started digging where the anomaly had been found. Very quickly they found a set of bones. 2 nylon stockings were tied around the neck bones. Hours after the remains were found, DiAnne Keidel was arrested. He was 58 years old and he was still living in Phoenix. Lori was able to bury her mother's remains next to the bodies of her 2 sisters. In early 1995, Lori and the firefighter who saved her, Ray Mullins, ended their romantic relationship. DiAnne Keidel went to trial in March 1995. The strongest evidence was Lori's testimony. She testified that she saw her father beat her mother and then bury her in the backyard. One problem was because of the state of the remains, DNA testing could not be done. That was a problem because Jean's lawyer could argue that it was not Diane's body. So an anthropologist used a process called photographic superimposition to identify the remains. This involves overlaying a photo of a victim when they were alive over their skull. Then she compared the position of the eye sockets, nasal passages, ear holes, and teeth. The anthropologist was 99% sure that the skull belonged to Diane. Also, a tree root from a neighbor's mulberry tree had grown through the skull. The root was sent to a dendrochronologist, an expert who can date the age of trees, at the University of Arizona. He concluded that the body was there before the tree was planted in 1978. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Then the jury deliberated for 3 days. They found DiAnne Keidel guilty of first-degree murder. In May 1995, he was sentenced to life in prison. That same month, Lori found out that the Maricopa County's medical examiner had changed the death certificate of her sisters. The cause of death was changed from accidental to arson. After the investigation was reopened in September 1993, 3 investigators from the fire department concluded it was an act of arson. Although it was now arson, it was decided that Jean wouldn't be charged with the murders of Susie and Kelly and the attempted murders of Lori and Greg. However, the district attorney told Lori if Jean had been acquitted of the murder of Diane, or he was going to be released, he would have been charged. But since he was already sentenced to life in prison, they decided not to follow through with the charges. In December 1995, Lori sued the city of Phoenix. She said that both the police and the fire departments were negligent in their investigations. As a result, her father stayed out of prison and she had to live with him. During that time, he abused her, one of his friends sexually abused her, and her brother and his friends sexually abused her. The city hired an out-of-state investigator to examine the evidence from the fire. The expert disagreed with the 3 experts from the Phoenix Fire Department and said that the fire had been accidental. He charged the city $50,000 for his work. In June 1998, Lori settled out of court with the city for $5.5 million. DiAnne Keidel died in custody at age 68 in December 2004. In 2023, Lori, who had remarried since the lawsuit and now had the last name Hodge, said that 55 years after the fire, she still had scars. Sometimes the scars crack and bleed. She called her father both wicked and evil. She believes that her father was held accountable for murdering his wife, daughter, and his stepdaughter in the afterlife. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. As we said in the opening, please visit criminallisted.com if you have any cases you want to suggest. But that's all for today. Thank you again for listening. Please stay safe and take care of yourself.